Hey guys, welcome to our first how-to video. Today we're going to tell you how to choose components for your build for computer, how to put them together, and how to see how they perform. That's a lot of hows, so let's get to it. Now, we're going to assume that if you want to build your own computer, you're doing it for gaming purposes. So our overview of how to choose your components are going to be from a gaming computer perspective. Now, the first component, and arguably the most important component of any computer build, is the CPU. The question to ask yourself is, what are you going to be using that CPU for? If you're just going to be doing gaming, all you need is a 4-core CPU. If you're going to be doing gaming and a little bit of video editing, a 8-core or a 6-core CPU will do as well. Now, there are two major brands out there. The only two ones that you will ever come into is AMD and Intel. Right here we've got an Intel i5 processor, and i5s are great for gaming because they have 4 cores and that's it. And then AMD, as you could see in our previous build, has a larger variety, so they have APUs and CPUs. Now, I like to think of AMD versus Intel like this. Intel is like a finely tuned German sports car. It is very efficient, power efficient, and very powerful. However, it is very expensive. Whereas AMD, on the other hand, is much more like an American muscle car. It has what it loses in efficiency, it makes up for in raw power. And they're also quite a bit cheaper. Now, Intel has better performance than AMD. Or the best Intel CPU will easily beat the best AMD CPU. However, I find AMD CPUs are more fun because you get to overclock and do things like that. So it's all a matter of opinion. If you're just going for gaming, I would recommend you getting an Intel i5, or if you're doing a bit of gaming / video editing, an Intel i7. If you want to have fun while gaming, not just because you're playing the game, but also because you get to overclock stuff, go with AMD. It's cheaper and more fun. Okay, and that wraps up how to choose a component for the CPU component of our build. Okay guys, the next part is our motherboard. What motherboard are you going to choose? Now, very important to note that different CPUs have different types of sockets. That means the connectors on the back of them are different. So once you've chosen your CPU, you have to make very sure that the motherboard you choose is also compatible with that CPU. For example, this Intel Core i5 is an LGA 1150 socket. And if you were to buy an LGA 1155 socket, 5-pin difference, it would not work at all. So that's why we've chosen to get a Fatality 1150 socket motherboard. Another important feature on a motherboard is its chipset. With Intel, it's fairly easy. They've got the H chipset and the Z chipset, and also another chipset which we won't talk about because it's a silly chipset. Now, the H chipset is for gaming and everyday use. The Z chipset is for extreme performance and enthusiast kind of stuff, so it's unlocked, you can change the timings on the CPU and the RAM and other stuff. So for this build, because we're just doing a build that's only for gaming, not for overclocking and stuff, we got a H97 chipset. The benefit of this is that it's also cheaper than the Z chipset. And that wraps up what kind of motherboard you should get for when you're gaming. Now, it's all very good having a CPU and motherboard, but how are you going to power it? This is a very good question. Some people struggle with how many watts of power in your power supply should you get. Now, generally, if you're going with a CPU, normal amounts of RAM, everything fairly normal like this is, you wouldn't use any more than 500 watts max, including a graphics card, unless you're using like the Radeon 290X2 or the Titan Z. You're not going to be using more than 500 watts of power. So it's always safe to go a little bit over what you expect to use. So in this case we chose a 600 watt power supply. You've got a 100+ watts room of buffer. And now a thing to note is that sometimes power supplies come with 80 plus bronze, silver, gold and platinum certified. Now, I'm aware there is another one which is even more than that, but the chance of you buying one of them is very slim. And this power supply is not even bronze certified because we're cheap. But there are other power supplies. It just means how efficient the power supply is from converting power that's taken from the wall and then sending it out. So this power supply is 600 watts, which means it can supply 600 watts to the computer components. But it could be drawing up to 800 watts from the wall. So that's just what it means. It's not an incredibly efficient power supply, but that doesn't really matter when it's only a 600 watt. Maybe if you're using a 1000 or 1500 watt power supply it would matter, but a 600 watt it's not going to make that big of a difference. So that wraps up our overview on what power supply to get. Okay guys, there are two types of storage primarily that you're ever going to hear about. You've got your typical hard drives and you have your solid state drives. Now, for gaming, it is important that you get a solid state drive. Some people say, oh, it's not that big of a deal, it's just a waste of money, but that's a lie. It makes a huge deal. Like, I have a friend who had a really old Dell, 80 years old, and it was terribly slow. I told him just buy a solid state drive, he got one, and now it's as fast as my computer, which is 6 years newer. So solid state drives make a huge performance boost for programs and data that's stored on it. For the hard drive, however, these are much bigger. The downside to solid state drives is that they're small and expensive, whereas hard drives, they're much, much larger, they can store much more data, and they're a lot cheaper. But the downside is obviously that they're not as fast. So what I like to do is install the operating system on a solid state drive and programs, and then your video files, music files, and things that don't need to be incredibly fast on your hard drive. And that's easy enough to do with Windows, you just change all the directory settings. And that wraps up our quick overview on storage options. Okay guys, now on to our next piece of components for our build is the graphics card. Now there are two main graphics card chip makers, which is AMD and Nvidia. However, there are many different brands who actually create the rest of the card. So AMD and Nvidia create the little chip, and then the other brands take that chip and put it onto a card. So this graphics card is a Sapphire. They're cheaper than like ASUS and Gigabyte, but their performance is pretty much the same. The only downside, the reason why they're cheaper, Sapphire, is because they don't have the branding name that ASUS and Gigabyte has. Nvidia and AMD cards, when it comes down to it, are very similar. It just depends on the time of year that, you know, which companies release their new line of cards and stuff like that. Whereas Nvidia uses CUDA cores, AMD uses OpenGL, and there are just a different amount of features. Like a game called Titanfall has Mantle integration, so AMD cards will perform much better when playing Titanfall. However, Watch Dogs, which is a new game that just came out, is more optimized to run Nvidia cards. So it just comes down to how much you're willing to pay and what games you're expecting to play. So that wraps up my quick overview on what graphics card to buy. Okay guys, on to our last thing is our RAM, our random access memory. For gaming, you just need to make sure that you have at least 8 gigs of RAM and a clock speed of 1600 MHz or above. Apart from that, there's not really going to be that big of an issue, because games very, very rarely use more than, let's say, 5 or 6 gigs of RAM, so you're not going to really need any more than 8. If you're editing videos or pictures, so like Adobe people there, you will need more than 8 gigs of RAM, it's not going to be enough, but for just playing games, which is what we're expecting to do with this PC, that's all you need. Okay, so now going on to an extra component that is completely optional for any type of build is a sound card. I know the sound card's not in there, that's because it's in my computer. Now, a sound card gives you better audio control, so you have extra software that can help you minimize background noise and stuff like that from your mic, and it just makes your sound better. In the past, I've been playing music and I can always hear this little like tickling and electrical noises in the background. That's because there's interference from the motherboard. So the benefit of having a discrete sound card is that it removes all of that noise. It's also got a much more powerful resistance for headphones, so you can make high resistance headphones sound louder. So that's an optional thing you can add. Now the last thing that you're going to want to choose as a component is the case. The case is probably the least important thing that you could possibly get. Now, if you're overclocking, you need good airflow, so the case may matter. Gaming, not so much. You're not going to get hot enough to overheat a case unless it's a really, really crappy case. Now, you can get a decent case for between $60 and $80, so you're not really going to run into any problems there. The important thing about a case is what features are you looking for, and does it look cool? Those are the only important things. Other than that, cases are completely up to you and they don't really matter. Now, the only important thing about a case is its size. That is, what size is the motherboard and what size can the case support. For example, this is an ATX motherboard, so when I bought my case, I had to be sure that the case could easily support a ATX motherboard. There are a few different types. There is a ITX, which is a very, very small board. It's yay big, around about the same size as that packaging. You have a M-ATX board, which is similar to an ATX board, except it has the bottom 1/4 chopped off, pretty much. So it's just a little smaller and only has 4 PCI slots as opposed to an ATX of 7. Then you have ATX, as I mentioned before, and then you have eATX, which is much, much larger, and you're going to have to find a very big case to fit them in. Apart from that, the only important thing about a case is, does it look cool, and what kind of features does it have? Airflow isn't really that important anymore, because cases are generally pretty good. However, you might want to make sure you have enough fans just to keep the airflow going if the case is a bit awkward. Okay, so just in case you weren't sure, the components we're using in this build is an Intel Core i5-4460. It's a low-end i5, however it has well refreshed and it will be able to play any games because it's a quad-core. Then going on to our memory, we have 8 GB in 2 sticks of G.Skill Sniper RAM running at 1600 MHz. It should be able to play any game easily. We have a Samsung solid-state drive 840 EVO, 128 gig version, so it will be fast. We can put our operating system on it and it will go well with the motherboard. We have also, for additional storage, is a 1 TB Western Digital blue drive. So it's not a green drive, so it's faster than a green drive, but slightly more expensive. We have a Cooler Master Thunder 600 watt power supply. It's not much to say about this. It's a solid power supply, it's quite heavy, and it's not modular, but it will get the job done. For our graphics card, we have a Sapphire Dual-X R9 270X graphics card. It's 2 GB of GDDR5 memory and has a boost clock of 150 MHz. Well, I should say 1050 MHz. There we are. And our final component is the ASRock Fatality H79 Performance Series 1 motherboard. And I've done an unboxing video of this yesterday I should say. And so if you're interested in seeing the close-up on it, then you can watch that.